Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. As part of the Artfluence Festival, the moderator for this morning's conversation. The title of the conversation of the panel is Gagged, Film, Censorship as a tool for democratic society. With three professionals working in the film industry who will be confronting and dealing and talking around their experience with the ways in which censorship has operated and intersected in their practice and with their work. But before we get into the conversation, I have to acknowledge the funders, partners, and sponsors for the festival. And they are the National Institutes for the Humanities and Social Sciences. It is Hear My Voice, behind the boards, so to speak. It's the Netherlands government, as well as the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So with that in order and out of the way, I kind of to give an outline of the panel. I will hand over to my co-panelists to introduce themselves. They will then hand over to me. I'll kind of do a very brief reading as a way to set the terrain for this conversation, after which we'll get into some questions and lead into a conversation. And around about 35 minutes into the conversation, we'll open up for some questions from the audience and leave the remaining time to explore those questions. We're hoping to be done. In fact, I have to ensure that we're done by 12 in order for everyone else to make their other commitments. So I hope that is fine. And so let me get into the introductions, perhaps. Chipo, might you want to go first?
Thank you so much, Russell. My name is Chipo Zhou. I am the head of the Durban International Film Festival. I am also lecturing and working on curriculum development for marketing and distribution of films for emerging filmmakers. I've worked in the film industry in various capacities for about 14 years now. And so it's very exciting to be a part of this new initiative, this panel, because I think the work that I've done over the last decade, or just slightly over a decade, does indeed kind of sit within the human rights space, trying to highlight voices of the disenfranchised and previously marginalized communities. Thank you.
Cait, did we hand over to you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Cait Pansegrouw. I am a producer and I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, but I work all over the continent. And I go by producer because that's what's professionally accepted, but I like to call myself a film doula because I believe the work that I do is help artists birth their films and then put our children out into the world. So our latest film that is making the rounds is This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection. It's the first film from the tiny nation of Lesotho made by a Lesotho filmmaker to ever be showcased internationally. It was Lesotho's first Oscar entry and first Golden Globes entry, and it recently won its 27th International Award. And it's a first feature by Lemohang Jeremiah Mosese. And I'm very passionate about working with marginalized voices and voices that are strong and distinct, and truly believe in the power of cinema to make grand statements and cause a healthy ruckus when needed. Thanks.
Last but not least, over to you, Ena.
Hello, thanks for having me. My name is Ena Sendijarevic. I'm a writer and director. I was born in Bosnia, but been living in the Netherlands for 25 years, and this is where I started building my career. I studied in the film school here in the Netherlands and as well as in Berlin. And I've been working as a filmmaker now for 10 years, about 10 years, made some short films, traveled with them a lot. And then I was able to make my first feature 3 years ago, Take Me Somewhere Nice, it's called. And now working on my next film. So that's me.
Thank you, colleagues. It is this accelerated capitalist world mixed with the violent patriarchal order that forms the basis for various forms of exploitation, both overt and subtle forms of exploitation. At a time when most forms of leadership have dismally failed, to whom do we turn? This globalized world also presents itself with an extreme entanglements where blind and informed decisions taken in Istanbul have consequences in Cape Verde, where decisions in Texas means death for thousands in Baghdad, the ripples of which affect migration flows across the globe. We're all in this mess, albeit in different ways. And so the question is escape possible? So where do we escape? What is escape? And what does it promise? With the growing skepticism against media and a populace that either thinks too clinically or lacks clear thinking at all, who and what do we trust as a sobering drug? Who amongst us is willing to place themselves in the firing line, susceptible to all kinds of social, state, and emotional violence under financial precarity? Well, the most critical of artists do this all the time. Who paints the zeitgeist? What tools are necessary to dismantle the master's house and build a communal space? What kind of expectations can we place on artistic practice of this time? To whom does art speak? And what ears are sufficient to listen? And with whose mother tongue do images speak? It's also fair to ask, what do artists expect from society? And when thinking about international solidarity, what the Berlin Conference inscribed, the Bandung Conference tried to undo. What was Festac 77, a moment in time to which we can never return. What to do with the intellectual legacy of people like Mbeki, Achebe, and Fela? What new radical contracts are possible between spectator, artwork, and the artist? And like society, artists are also fraught beings, haunted and anxious. Yet it is through their haunting that we, as society, are liberated. And so what I seek to do with this panel, with my co-panelists, is to explore and think through censorship and how it operates in its various modes. And so I'll start with you here, Cait. So you brought into this conversation due to a film, Inleba, that brought great debates, as you said, positive ruckus were needed in this country. And I'd like to resist the temptation to dwell on the film, but rather I'd like to use a film to think more broadly around the valences of suppression, censorship, and intimidation. So could you perhaps enter with some kind of context of the film to start with, and maybe through that draw a broader terrain trying to respond to this question of censorship and how it kind of masks itself to hide deeper lying issues that people maybe have not confronted, or maybe we as a country have not confronted. Yeah.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks for this conversation. I think it's such an important one to have. And what happened with Inleba, international titles, The Wound, for those who are not Xhosa speakers, it was significant because it was so multifaceted. And what ensued became more about the film itself and the context I can provide for those of you who haven't seen the film or aren't aware of what happened in South Africa. Inleba is a gay love story set within a traditional rites of passage into manhood involving circumcision. And this is a setting that is inherently a deeply patriarchal space. The film, which shows no penises, has two very brief love scenes where no genitals are visible. But the film ended up being reclassified as pornography, meaning it could not be exhibited publicly. So when the film was initially released, it was released under a 16 age restriction. And there were extensive protests, demonstrations countrywide. Cinemas were targeted, staff were threatened. And so eventually the film was taken off circuit. There was also extensive hate speech against, or towards rather, the filmmakers and the cast. And so this really became about freedom of expression. The film was not immediately reclassified, so it was taken off circuit for about 3 weeks. And it became about freedom of expression. It became about a really fascinating and interesting and pertinent conversation around who has the right to tell what stories. And it also became about queer representation, and specifically Black queer bodies in this country, because there was certainly an attempt by some factions to pursue some kind of erasure of Black queerness in this country. And it was quite a enormously terrifying and an angering experience for me, because as the producer, you are largely responsible for your team. I also cast directed the film, and the film, which took 2 years to put the cast together, and they were predominantly non-actors. For many of the younger cast, it was their first time ever appearing in a film, and they were being targeted, they were being threatened. Some of them were almost substantially physically harmed by people, and there was a lot to take on. And so, we're not fools. When we put this project together, we were vastly aware of the fact that it was going to be a potent cocktail of issues, and that it was certainly going to get a strong response from people. But what we didn't anticipate was the level of violence that we experienced, and the people's just kind of blatantness with regards to the violence. I mean, people were sending us threats on social media where, their names were on the threats. We could easily track these people. They could be reprimanded if we wanted to pursue that action. And so there was an entitlement from the people that were threatening us, a level of entitlement. And so I also, I'm going to speak mostly from my personal experience. And as a woman, it was a very interesting experience to be facing the patriarchy head on, as it were, and certainly facing multiple forms of intimidation around every turn. I had many people, people that kind of work together with government, but that are not necessarily government bodies, telling me that, people were going to die as a result of this film, and their blood would be on my hands. People threatening my personal safety, people coming to where I lived, people going to the houses of my team members and threatening them. And as a woman, in some of those spaces, I was not allowed to speak. When we had to do screenings for the Xhosa royal family, I was not allowed to address the royal family, the king and the princes. I had to sit below them. And so when really problematic statements were being made particularly around the erasure of Black queerness, and these statements around queerness not existing in this culture, I was not allowed to respond, or I was asked not to respond. I did, because I'm not much for the rules, but it was a significant period of my life that, you know, forever altered me. And I'm eternally grateful for it, because it was a real sort of confirmation that I was in the right space and doing the right things, and that it sort of clarified for me that filmmaking, not always, but it can be political and it can be a form of activism, and that as a producer, as a filmmaker, was really important to me. And I wasn't aware of the gravity of that before I made this film and experienced what I did.
Thank you for that. Thanks for that, Cait. Come across to you, Chipo, in your role as a festival director. On the one hand, your role is interesting, I think, to some degree, because you have the powers to mute and kind of channel certain conversations in the form of film, of course. You also have the responsibility. So in this way, you can kind of be seen as a gatekeeper. Yeah, it's like this incredible and important platform on the continent that represents and promotes film. And so the responsibility that you hold is quite big. At the same time, you are under some kind of pressure and need to comply to a set of expectations, demands, and requests from funders, from sponsors, from large production companies, for example. So I'm interested to think about how censorship might operate, how it might operate in your world, because maybe it's not as overt as in the ways that Cait has described. Yeah, it plays in different ways. You know, there's a language and there's a face to this thing. How do you confront and deal with this idea of repression, censorship, and silencing or erasure in your work?
Thanks so much, Russell. I think that's definitely a very important question, and an interesting one as well, because you're right. It's definitely it's definitely different to how Cait has faced it, because I think as a producer, as a film producer, the film is kind of tied directly to their names, whereas with the festival, even though I am the artistic director, any question or query is directed at the organization as opposed to being an individual attack. And so I think I definitely have it better in that regard. What we've tried to do, I think, as a festival over the years has just to be a platform that showcases films that spark the difficult conversations and discussions, and just it's a safe space. It's a platform with industry professionals. It's a platform with adults, and we hope to say mature audiences that are really, watching and understanding and interacting and engaging with the programs or the showcases that we have. And so we feel like this is where we should actually be having this healthy ruckus, to quote Cait. And so we've been lucky in that we can really take that bold stance and that bold move and showcase these films. I think in 2017 when Inleba came out, we actually did screen it at the festival at DIF, and there was a lot of pressure. I mean, you get phone calls saying, "Are you really sure you want to showcase this film?" There was a lot of pressure from all sorts of organizations and individuals to really say, "No, you're not supposed to screen this particular film." But we felt that if we don't screen it at our platform and allow for these conversations to happen and allow for both sides of the table to sit and engage and really understand where each other are coming from and really find a middle ground, then where do these conversations happen? And so it was really it was interesting that that happened and that the festival did happen. The film was a success. It actually won awards. So it was like to critical acclaim from an industry perspective as well. And audiences that attended the festival really gave good feedback. So it was really an interesting dynamic. That you had festival goers, you had film lovers, understanding the project for what it was. And then you had audiences. In fact, a lot of the audiences that were online, I followed the conversation on Twitter. A lot of them hadn't even watched the film. So there's a lot of vitriol coming from people who had not watched the film and therefore didn't even understand what the conversation was about. So that was really interesting. But I think as a festival, you know, what we try to do is just support the arts as it is, just support the voices to ensure that these conversations take place. We're in a continent that really is, I think actually even globally still, we're still riddled with patriarchy. And a lot of governments are becoming really sophisticated with using misinformation to keep people and artists and filmmakers on edge and misinformed about what's going on within the spaces. And so platforms that allow for honest takes, biased as they may be, because each and every person comes with their own point of view or their own perspective, is important to be able to allow the different perspectives to come together so we get a clearer picture and a clearer understanding of what's happening. So we also, as an organization, have funders and partners who have their own mandates, who have their own expectations. And so we also, you know, when we program and curate, we also have to think about fulfilling some of those mandates. And yes, sometimes really it does come with questioning whether or not we should put out certain kinds of content. And of course, as a festival, we report to the censorship board, like all the films that are screened at the festival have to go through that process. And so also, you know, there are those checks and balances. And as much as we want, you know, to go extremely free and fair and say, okay, here's a platform, let's say what we want to say and have these discussions and have robust engagements, we also have to adhere to the compliances that are required by the nation that we work in. And so that does kind of make it a little difficult. Luckily for us, we really haven't had those challenges, you know, in the festival over the last few years. I know something did happen prior to my arrival that was quite problematic and that really made waves, you know, in the industry around the censorship. I think for us as well, a lot of the censorship happens during the programming process where we self-censor. So it's not necessarily external censorship. You know, where you have a film, I think I can't even mention the name now of the film, but we had a film that was really good, but then something happened with the director and there was an outcry. Nobody knew we had selected the film, but internally we knew we wanted to showcase the film. But the issues surrounding the director and the reputational consequences that would have arisen from screening that particular film at that particular time, we felt, you know, was not worth the risk. So yeah, I think in some ways we are gatekeepers because we didn't showcase that work, you know. But in other ways, I think for the most part, we do try to push the boundaries to allow this freedom of expression and to allow for conversations that could potentially shift thinking and policy and the way we view the world and each other.
Ena, I'll come across to you here, and I have to read this question because I've got to make sure that I articulate it in the way that I thought about it. So, I'd like to bring you in for us to think about international solidarity, and so. In work a criteria
Apologies, attendees.
Apologies for that. We seem to have lost Russell to some technical difficulties. I think he'll be back shortly, but we'll continue the discussion, and I think I'll just take over from where Russell left off and ask and just chat to Ena a little bit. We'd just love to bring you in from the perspective of international solidarity. We've gathered that your migration featured quite a bit in your personal and family history. On that basis, wonder on the kind of relationship you have with the cross-national forms of solidarity, and how do you manage your artistic voice in such a case? For example, are there matters closer to your heart based on your habitation in that environment? Or do you use a different criteria to decide which matters are worth artistic responses through your work? And of course, if because you work in so many different regions, if you've ever really encountered situations where censorship was an issue for you, or just struggling with getting your work out there.
Yes. Yes, so migration is a big part of my own personal history, having been born in Bosnia and having grown up in the Netherlands. And my debut feature film is also dealing with these two countries, actually. I think a starting point there was not as much, okay, let's make a film about international solidarity, but it was something that started because it was close to my heart, yes, to my personal experiences. Not to say that the film was autobiographic, but I did want to use some of the worlds where I grew up in, or some of the situations that I witnessed, or some of the tensions that I felt during my upbringing between these two countries. I did want to use them as material in order to understand, actually, more than anything, to understand what these tensions were all about. So I would say, yes, I would say that it was fueled by some kind of personal starting point. But then also having had traveled with my short films previously, and now also with this film, because it was right before the pandemic that it was at the festivals, I also realized how the whole festival industry, how it is and has become in my personal life some kind of a safe haven, where you are kind of, especially in the short film world, where you are, it feels like some kind of area apart from the rest of the world, where you are able to talk about everything, where you can push boundaries, where you can, where you don't have to be afraid of censorship, because actually the more straightforward, or the more you touch upon these boundaries, the more interesting the conversations get. But I did feel a difference with this feature film that where we had our screenings in Bosnia, for example, I did feel, there was some tension there around the film. The festival was attacked, for example, on Twitter, like, why did you program this film? I mean, the film doesn't only deal with the topic of migration, but also with sexuality, also with, it's a film that tries to talk about what victimhood is, that tries to what I also try to do is take this sensationalist view on these topics away. And I think, yes, this film was also in the Netherlands as well labeled as 16+, which in the Netherlands wasn't a problem, but in the film was not distributed in Bosnia, for example. So my question for myself was also, is this censorship? Could you say this is censorship when a film is not distributed in a country? It's a vague area. It's hard to know, because when we look in the Netherlands, there's a lot of films that are not distributed. It's also the question, what does the market want? So we live in a capitalist society, and there's also a certain danger in the Netherlands that I perceive, where activism has also become a commodity. So I don't see myself as an activist in that sense, because I do agree with Cait that I think art is political in a way. It's actually always political, but that doesn't mean that the artist has to be an activist. So yes, so there are films that are in Netherlands that are not distributed because there's no market for it, but they can be very interesting and actually have more to say about certain issues than other films that are very easy digestible. So yeah, that was all I wanted to say about that. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Sometimes the best laid plans fail, and this is testament. So I apologize for dropping off there. I had all the backups that I thought was needed, but still disconnected. I think you're on a really interesting trajectory there, Ena, and I wanted to find out if maybe Chipo or Cait might want to pick up on some of the points you mentioned, because I think they're so specific to the relationship between festivals, markets, and critical artistic work, Might you have something to respond to there?
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's a lot of interesting, takeaways from that. Take Me Somewhere Nice was actually at DIF last year, and it won the award for best cinematography. I think it was one of my favorite films last year, if I'm allowed to say that. And it was just interesting because I actually hadn't realized that it could actually get that kind of response from that part of the world. We always look at a lot of the third world countries and say this is where we're really still heavily impacted by the effects of patriarchy, and we have a lot of dictatorship going on. So even in the free world, or we do have issues like this. It's quite interesting to note that. It was a really intricate film, and of course, the takings. I think sexuality is a really difficult subject to tackle across the board. This is what I'm kind of getting, and I'm getting sensing, and I'm thinking a lot of people are uncomfortable. A lot of governments are uncomfortable. A lot of festivals are uncomfortable. But I think you did raise a really interesting question when you were asking about, if a film is not screened in a certain country, is that really censorship? Just from a festival perspective, for example, we have this year 3,000 submissions, and we only have space for about 100 films to screen. There are a lot of powerful films that I think could make for interesting viewership, interesting engagement, that could create robust, discussions internationally that we can't showcase just because we can only show a certain number of films. And so it's really a difficult space to be in, that, there's so much content from across the world, but only a limited space to be able to kind of showcase that work. And I think this is where the role of social media and the role of just now streaming services and being able to showcase your work on different online platforms can kind of break down those barriers. And so if, we don't screen it in the theaters in South Africa, for example, South Africans can still access that film either through Netflix or other streaming platforms that will give the film an opportunity to be able to do so. So I think we're moving in a slightly different direction in terms of censorship and not being able to get work out there. And I'm quite excited to see where that goes. Yeah.
Please go for it, Ena. Go for it.
Okay. Yes, in reaction to that, I think, when you are talking about Europe as being the free world, this is something that triggered some thoughts in me, because of course, in this case, I'm highlighting a difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And also, Bosnia being not in the EU. In that sense, you could almost say it's also kind of a free space, a space where, some of the rules are not in place. The rules that are the strict, you might say capitalist ways of dynamics that are very much here in the Netherlands going on. So in a way, the film was shown in the Netherlands, in the cinema. Not many people were talking about the different more provocative parts of the film. Paul Verhoeven is from the Netherlands, it's not a coincidence. But to me, it also felt like what also lacked was the possibility for the film to change society. Sure. So it also felt like, okay, let's just consume this among all these other films that we can consume. And we are immune to what it could trigger with us. And I think the film was a much bigger threat in Bosnia, for example, where something more was at stake, or people were actually maybe even engaging more with the film than they did in the Netherlands. So there is that's something that I thought about. The discussions were much more interesting in Bosnia, I think. Yeah, so maybe we have become immune in the Netherlands to the power of cinema to change us. And this is even a bigger danger, I would say. Yeah.
Ena, I love what you said about the market and how the market dictates what is made available for people to watch, because in my experience with Ingceba, there was massive demand for people to watch it. And so when the reclassification happened and it was, rated pornography and it couldn't be exhibited publicly, there was a massive outcry. There was an outcry when it was in cinema, but there was an equal, if not more powerful outcry when it was taken off of cinema and it was not available to people. And, the other thing that this whole adventure stirred up, which I forgot to mention, is, the right we have to access content, the right we have to access media, and how a small faction of, well, firstly through the reclassification, but also on sort of a grassroots level of a faction of people who were against the film, preventing other people from being able to see it, through protesting at cinemas, through, behaving violently, and our police force or the government not necessarily getting involved when that was happening. You know, people were literally taking weapons to the cinema with the intent of harming people. And so it's not a straightforward conversation when we talk about the market and we talk about demand, because this is how this all sort of feeds into the silencing and the erasure of queer voices, is that, so, you know, because they're a so-called minority, or for some people, because this community doesn't exist at all or shouldn't exist at all, they should not be given the right to access content where they feel represented. And so that was also one of the sort of big catalysts that made everything around the film become bigger than the film. And, you know, once the film, a whole legal battle took place, and I managed to get the film reclassified again so that it could go back to cinema. And it was the most amazing feeling to walk into cinemas with Black queer youth, you know, under 30, who don't frequent art house cinemas in this country, literally packed to the brim with people sitting on the floor just so that they could get into the cinema to watch it. And so I'll always be eternally grateful for the people that really loved the film, and really, or even if they didn't love it, people that just wanted to take part in an informed debate rather than watch a trailer, draw your own conclusions, and then, you know, disable other people from being able to access it so that the conversation couldn't go any further. I will always be so thankful to everyone who showed up in the cinema, because they made it possible for our film to be exhibited and to stay on circuit for as long as it did.
So in your experiences, what might you think the decisions and the impacts of your work leaves behind? So, I mean, I think in the context of Ingleba, Cait, I mean, I don't know, but I would imagine there's more kind of, perhaps filmmakers have a greater level of courage to produce work that breaks the mold, because others have done it before. And of course, it's those who are at the front line who have to take most of the heat for this kind of work. But it certainly leaves something in our society and in the industry. And so maybe could you reflect on the legacy that Ingleba and all the surrounding events has left in South Africa, and what has it meant for the film industry and producing content that is that kind of goes against the grain, yeah, and speaks to marginalized and minority voices. And I'd invite you to do the same from your context, Ena.
Thanks, Russell. It's a great question. A lot of people did tell me that they were emboldened through watching this all unfold. I mean, the legal process off and on took about 6 months before we were able to overturn the wrongful classification of the film. And what we kept saying throughout all of the, you know, the articles and the social media and the interviews is, people were saying, this is wrong. This depiction of the ritual is wrong. It's incorrect. It's false. And we were saying, that's great. Why don't you make a film, you know, that speaks to your truth? And can we all have a conversation around there not being one truth, that truth looks and feels differently to different people, and everyone's version of the truth is valid? So we were constantly inviting people to make their own version of the film, or make a film set in that space that they felt depicted it correctly, whatever correct means to you. And let's all watch these various films, these various takes on it, and have a discussion about it. We didn't make a documentary. We weren't saying this is Bible, this is what happens there. It was a love story set in a very specific context. And so I think that's what I am most proud of throughout this whole experience, is that people contacted us and said, thank you for telling our story. Thank you that you represented us. You've now given us a tool or a mechanism or the courage to speak out about our truth, whether that's in literature, whether it's on social media, whether it's a conversation with a family member that you didn't feel equipped to have before. And that's the real power of cinema for me. And that's why it was such a pivotal and incredible experience in my life, despite all the violence and the heartache involved.
And Ena, please feel free to come in here. But before you do, I just want to prime Chipo on the other hand, for you to maybe start thinking about the, I guess, to think of the impact of the festival. And I mean, DIF has had a number of issues of trying to deal with films that are either scheduled and there's some kind of public backlash or outcry. So could you also think about what then does a festival platform, what role does a festival play in that context, and whose interests should we prioritize in that equation? Over to you, Ena.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, to be honest. To know exactly what the effect was of the film.
But sometimes for yourself as well as a filmmaker, if you maybe feel that it's too broad a bigger question, but kind of in your practice, what has that experience meant for you? I mean, if you need some more time, we can maybe shift over to Chipo, and she might have some answers from the perspective, position of a festival.
Is that okay for you, Chipo? Then I'm going to think about a little bit longer.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think, definitely as a festival, when we have all these conflicting interests, our main constituent is serving the audiences. The filmmakers are making films for audiences to engage with. We as a festival are that platform that connects the filmmakers and the audiences. And so whenever we do take such decisions, we're factoring in, does this benefit the audience in any way? And we weigh, okay, is it more important to not showcase the film? Or is it important that audiences access this film and come to their own conclusions and draw their own conclusions and also, get drawn into the conversations? I think what we've done as well has just been to kind of, openly engage with these topics that are really different. And this is, I think, even from the inception of the festival. I mean, it was started during apartheid at a time when access to some films was really, difficult and illegal in some cases. And the idea was to showcase the films, that government was saying, no, they shouldn't be screened, they shouldn't be accessed by the public, and showcase them, talk about them, and, allow for critical engagement with the world around us. I think when people make art, when filmmakers or artists make art or their work, they show their own point of views, they tell their own truths, they tell stories that reflect society in one way or another, and they tackle issues that are contemporary, that they're facing in the different spaces that they're in. I mean, every year we see when we receive submissions, the running themes across the various submissions is quite similar, specifically because we're a global community that is now kind of accessible to each other. And so even the issues that we're all tackling are really similar. And so I think for us as a festival, it's really important that our audiences get to engage with this content, not just because it's good art, but also because it really does allow us to see different perspectives and widen our views. And, hopefully we grow from it and we learn to accept that there is more than one truth, just to quote Cait again. Yeah.
I mean, Ena, you don't have to respond to this question.
No, yes, okay. I can. No, I think for me, one of the things, and I think that goes for a lot of filmmakers that had their films I mean, especially their first films, first feature films out around the time of the pandemic or right before, which is something that happened to me as well. I think one of the things that you have to, that everyone had to kind of deal with is this topic of representation, because we and now because of the pandemic, and look at us now here, we've moved to this digital world, and the physical world is, you know, is becoming less and less are the main place where we operate. So if we're moving to the digital world, then the question of representation becomes more and more important, because then everybody from the physical world has to move to this world as well. And I think with my film, I had, you know, having had made this film before this big migration was happening. The journey of this film made me reflect a lot about how what my place was in this migration. And I think in the end, yes, and also for me, it's also another thing that I'm trying to understand is in which way film is art. And we are now at the Artfluence festival, of course, but it also says like influence through art, you know, like, and what we were talking about earlier, is this activism or not? You know, should art or cinema be also a free space where you don't follow trends in a way, and yes, so have a place for research. So these are things that I started to think about a lot, you know, through this film, actually, as a catalyst for these kind of thoughts, and I will continue to find some answers for them, hopefully.
So we have just under 8 minutes left, and so we'll move towards some kind of conclusion by way of trying to, and it's not a question, but it's something I might put forward and see where it takes this conversation in closing. So on the one hand, I'm thinking, what kind of support might people in your respective positions require or need in a very messy and complicated setup, which is regulators, it's markets, demand. So there are a number of things that I think artists ultimately find themselves being entangled in, and it has an impact on how they survive, how the work gets out. And so I'd like to understand what are the expectations from artists to society, to the community that they operate in and the world that they live in, you know? So for example, if I maybe use Cait's, or maybe it was Chipo who made this point, as we're following Inleba online, you discovered that some people had opinions, but it had not watched the film. And so what does that say then about like critical engagement with subject matter, you know? The decision that you have to make, Chipo, has ripples because other festivals on the continent and beyond are looking at you to see what kind of decision you make because it impacts on the decision that they make, you know? So there's a very complicated web that we find ourselves in as artists, as producers of knowledge, particularly knowledge that tries to break ground and brings home the ghosts, if you will, you know? So how might we assemble a supportive structure to the players who find themselves at the center of this complicated web? Phew, sorry. It's a gargantuan question or proposition.
I mean, Russell, you kind of said it in your question. It's around critical thinking, right? It's about showing up and watching the thing and forming an opinion and feeling and thinking however you feel and think about the piece of work, but giving people the space to have their own thoughts and feelings around the work. And And I mean, Chipo spoke to it earlier, like, let's have a mature discussion. We're mostly all adults in this space. And so let's act that way. And I think that was the absurd thing that we all experienced, is that we're dealing with other adults here for the most part, and people's behavior is just completely, I don't even want to say juvenile, because I feel like it's an insult to the youth, but it was just completely unacceptable. And so it's, you know, we all have freedom of choice. We should all have freedom of choice. If you don't want to watch the film, if you don't want to watch a film, no one is forcing you to watch the film. It's not Clockwork Orange where you're strapped down with your eyeballs open. It's, you know, don't go to the cinema, don't support it. That's completely fine. And give people the freedom who do want to watch it, or who are curious, the space to exercise their right.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm not going to add a lot to what Cait said, because I think she's really articulated it very well. But just to say, just also, as Ena pointed out, that just to let artists be art and not really follow trends. And I think when I was speaking about how we see similar threads following through in productions, it's mostly to do with what they're seeing around them. So it's not even about following trends. This is what is happening, and we're depicting it in the stories that we live in our, you know, societies, and being allowed to create and to tell your stories the way you see them, and then have people watch and form their own opinions. I think just exactly how Cait articulated it. And as festivals, when we see films, we are hoping that our audiences are able to just engage with the material and all the delicate, you know, topics that are covered in the various stories that are told.
Yes, I don't have much to add to that. But just when you mentioned Clockwork Orange, it's funny that this is a film that was censored, you know, and it was pulled from the cinemas in the UK. So I think maybe as artists, it's also good to see all these moments in history where this, you know, actually where good work is always has some, has some
faces resistance.
Exactly, it has to face resistance, and it can also be empowering to know this, and to find some comfort in that as well. Yeah.
One last thing I would love to say, Russell, if I may, in terms of support, and Chipo commented on it briefly, is this notion around art needing to be a commodity, or needing to be commercial in order to be deemed successful. And I think particularly when we're speaking to art institutions that make our work possible, I really feel that, you know, that's their function. They need to be making it possible for artists to create. And so, you know, not this idea of sort of one banner of success that we all need to fall under, I think is one of the massive downfalls of our industry. Some films were made for a niche audience, some films were made for a mass audience, some films were made to be political, others not. And there's space for there should be space for all these films to exist. And that's the beauty of film festivals, right? Is the safe space where all these different forms of cinema can come together. But the point is, for me, when we're talking about institutions that support artists, you're supporting the artist, you're supporting their voice and what they want to say. So dictating to the artist, your film needs to be about X, Y, and Z, or you need to tick X, Y, and Z box in order for us to give you this funding, for me is completely just the opposite of what people in those positions, the gatekeepers, should be doing. You know, there are other channels that commercial films have access to, that more niche audience films, independent cinema, art house cinema, experimental cinema do not have access to? And where is the support for those kinds of cinema is what I'm interested in, particularly in my role as a producer, is making space and making it possible for those types of works to exist.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thanks for that point, Cait. I hope the funders and the supporters of art makers are listening to. And so we're on the hour now. I have to start by thanking all of you for making the time for the intellectual contribution to this conversation and this panel. I'd like to thank all the invisible labor that does not appear on the front end of such platforms. So to create and put in the hours to make this platform and these conversations happen. So I kind of want to acknowledge that. The organizers, curators, and everyone who was involved to make this what it is today. Eternally grateful. And on that point, I will say thank you and goodbye. Have a wonderful Friday and weekend.